Looking down from the crumbling Gothic spires of an ancient castle, Count Strahd von Zarovich smiles. His plan is working. Between the flashes of lightning, he can clearly see the foolish adventurers making their way towards his fortress. The master of Castle Ravenloft is having guests for dinner, and you are invited. Hey everyone, I'm Gary and welcome back. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to do a big gaming deep dive on Ravenloft. This is going to be a two-part kind of series. And the first part, I'm going to look at the original Ravenloft module, the module that kind of like started it all out. And then I'm going to also kind of like move on and look at how from that, Ravenloft was developed into one of the most successful settings during the second edition period of D&D. And how that kind of is informing the rules of that particular setting. Now, in the second part, I'm going to look at Curse of Strahd, which is probably the most recent big adventure set in Ravenloft for 5th edition. And that will be more kind of like one of my traditional reviews where I talk about why I think it works and why I think it doesn't work for certain reasons and at certain times. And so let's take a look then at the first ever module. This is Ravenloft. That's what it's called. It's by Tracy and Laura Hickman of Dragonlance fame. And it is the 6th module in the I series for 1st edition AD&D. Now, the I series meant intermediate, so it was for characters of kind of 4th to kind of like 9th level, that sort of kind of like level range. And it's meant to present a reasonable challenge to a relatively experienced group of characters, but also a relatively experienced group of players. Most of the modules in the I series, including this one, most of them are standalone. There is a couple that kind of like a part of the sequence. There is an official kind of sequel to Ravenloft, for example, but most of them are just standalone adventures. The module was written by Tracy and Laura Hickman, and it was first published in 1983. The module is 32 pages long. It has these two beautiful fold-out maps that cover. So it's hard to see, but a lot of these AD&D modules have these. The actual cover comes off. And you get these beautiful maps. And this is the same with a lot of Tracy Hickman's maps. If you look at the first Dragonlance modules, for example, these are very, very similar. They're absolutely gorgeous. And these maps, they cover Castle Ravenloft itself and the nearby village of Barovia. So what's the through line to that first ever module, I6, Ravenloft? Well, the players come to the village of Barovia. It's a kind of benighted place where each night dark things creep from nearby Castle Ravenloft and attack the villagers. The villagers, lives very much in the shadow of the castle. The party discover relatively quickly that they can't leave the village and the kind of surrounding environs because of a kind of a magical mist that surrounds the whole village and the kind of the valley. And anyone who attempts to like leave through the mist is actually they're killed. Right, the mist doesn't allow them to leave; they become prisoners of the mist, and this becomes a recurring idea that helps define Ravenloft, not just the module, but Ravenloft as a setting. Speaking with the villagers, it becomes clear that a group of traveling people, the Vistani, have set up their kind of barrel-top wagon camp nearby. So, speaking with the Vistani fortune teller, Madame Eva. And she gives them a card reading, which is kind of like it's a kind of play on a tarot reading. The party learn that their imprisonment in this place will continue until they have destroyed or defeated the vampire lord of the nearby castle, Count Strahd von Zarovich. As part of the reading, they learn what Strahd's goals are, and they learn the location of several items within Castle Ravenloft that can help them destroy him. So, thus armed with this information, the party enter Castle Ravenloft, explore its kind of crumbling keeps, its catacombs beneath, its kind of lightning-threatened towers, and eventually they face down against the vampire Strahd and hopefully defeat him. Now, why is this module good? What do I like about this module? Like, even just from a ludic perspective, like, why is this cool? Why was this so... it's the 6th module in the I series. Why is this one the one that leaps out of people? Well, the module is seminal for D&D and for, and role-playing for lots of different reasons. Firstly, the villain, Strahd von Zarovich, is a developed villain. Before this, D&D had a tendency to its adventures were just kind of dungeon crawls. They had come out of the dungeon now. The very, very, very earliest D&D campaigns were basically just they were the dungeon, right? There wasn't a campaign setting. There was a dungeon master's dungeon. That's what it was. That's why we're called dungeon masters. And then in the late 70s, but really the early 80s, with games like Call of Cthulhu, and then modules like this, and then Tracy Hickman also is involved heavily with Margaret Weiss and Crypt and Dragonlance. We get this sense that actually we can tell a more interesting and developed story using the medium of role-playing games. So Strahd is really interesting, and he's kind of like the first example in D&D of an interesting, developed villain with motivations. Obviously, he's very heavily influenced by Dracula as a conception. He proves that D&D could do interesting villains with kind of like tragic backstories, in a way that had kind of not previously been done. So that's quite important. I've talked about the value of a good villain, a strong villain, before in my video on yam-shaped adventure structure, and how this is one of the necessary things to help you produce the perfect kind of adventuring story structure. If you click in the top right now, I'll put a link to it. The other thing that this module does, besides an interesting, developed three-dimensional villain, is that it mechanized replayability. The card reading that Madame Eva gives the player characters is called the Taroka deck. Like I say, it's a play on tarot cards, and what she does is she lays out the goals and where the items in the castle will be using a set of playing cards. But what's really interesting about this is that it actually depends what cards come up. That determines where things are. So if you were to do it once, and then the items are like in one place, but maybe they're in the catacombs where the players need to go, then the second time you do it, you'll get something totally different. It might be that they are in one of the spires, or maybe even one of the attics of Ravenloft, or they might be somewhere else. So there's a replayability there as well. But what I particularly love about this version of the Taroka deck, this very first one, is because the Taroka deck is something that comes up throughout Ravenloft supplements, up to and including Curse of Strahd, the most recent version of this adventure, is that we also get Strahd's goals. So there's kind of like a bit of kind of story game element to this, where we go, okay, what is Strahd actually trying to do here? Is he trying to get hold of Irina Koliana, who he believes is the reincarnation of his one true love? Or is he working on some kind of dark alchemical apparatus somewhere in the castle? What is his goal? And I love the idea that this can kind of change and develop each time you play it. You can play Castle Ravenloft. You can play Ravenloft I6 in one evening, and maybe you even should right around Halloween. That'd be really, really, really good fun. This mechanic is fantastic, and it is just worth re-saying that. Firstly, strong villain. Secondly, cool mechanic. Thirdly, there's a really strong theme. Strong themes, I think, are to some extent really hard to pull off in D&D, because the theme is already set. The theme is heroic fantasy adventure, and what that means kind of shifts and changes like Mercury over time, right? The heroic fantasy of 1970s D&D is not the same as like 2017 D&D, but it's just worth saying that there is already kind of like quite a lot of genre built into the game, and therefore doing a strong theme can be quite difficult. But I think Gothic fantasy, not Gothic horror, we're not telling horror, Gothic fantasy works really well here. There's always a risk when doing things like this. I think with D&D, you can see it in something like Tomb of Annihilation, which is like jungles and like Journey to the Center of the Earth, like Jules Verne-esque kind of like adventure kind of fiction. There's always the risk that the adventure just becomes a sort of a theme park, right? Okay, we're doing the Gothic theme park this week. It's like a Hammer horror kind of like, it's just the accoutrements of Gothicism, but there's not actually anything truly Gothic about it. It's just wearing a Gothic skin. But I actually think I would make the strong thesis and argument, and I'd love to have kind of someone argue against this, that actually Ravenloft does true Gothic. I think it captures and bottles a little bit of the despair, a little bit of the kind of transgressive nature of Gothicism, which I think is wonderful. The last thing to say that I really like, and I've kind of briefly mentioned this already, is that the artworks and maps. Now, all the art, including the cover art, and all the colour illustrations, as far as I can tell, sorry, all the interior illustrations, as far as I can tell, were done by Clyde Caldwell, and it's just perfectly 80s. It's just, I mean, I love it. The maps are isometric, which I believe were designed by Tracy Hickman. And one thing that's cool about isometric maps, he would do this again in Dragonlance. There's a really cool map of Zaxxor off a dungeon, the dungeon in the first Dragonlance module that does the same. These isometric maps, while they are actually harder to use at the table, I don't think that usability is necessarily a consideration. One thing they do that is wonderful that you can't do with a flat map is that it really conveys the scale of this place. It's a feast for the eyes to look at. So that is I6, and that is what's going on in this module. That's what's going on in this module, and why you should take a look at it. Now, what happened when this was released is that it was really, really, really popular. So let's talk about some of the sequels and expansions to Ravenloft. Now, there is an official expansion to that module. So I6 comes out, and then I10 is the house on Griffin Hill. I don't own a copy of this, but this basically deals with a body-snatching, disembodied Strahd in Mordantshire. Now, what's really cool is that Ravenloft is kind of the first half of the novel Dracula. It's kind of going to the kind of Transylvania type kind of place and entering the castle and interacting with like the Brides of Strahd and all that kind of stuff. And then the house on Griffin Hill is kind of the second half of Dracula. And it deals with, like I said, Mordantshire rather than Barovia. And Mordantshire is a sort of fictionalized version of Whitby in Yorkshire, which is where the second half of Dracula is set. And what's really cool about that is that, again, we have this mechanized idea that the game master doesn't get to choose the whole sort of story. It's influenced by kind of like random mechanics. And in that, a disembodied creature is kind of like passing from person to person in Mordantshire, in Mordant. And it's not always obvious to the players which NPCs they can trust and at which time, because they might be kind of being currently possessed. That's really, really, really good fun. That module also introduces Azalin the Lich Lord, who becomes one of the other kind of, as Ravenloft becomes a setting, he becomes a kind of major character, another kind of like Dark Lord, like Strahd in the setting. And I just think it's wonderful, right? I've never run the House on Griffin Hill, but I'd really like to. It reviewed really well when it first came out. I hear that it's quite dense in terms of the prose, and you have to really kind of get your head around it before you can run it, but that is worth it. So that's the official sequel. Now, what happens throughout the 80s and then the early 90s, as we move from first edition into second edition, and there's a bit of an overlap between the two, is that TSR realizes that they can make a lot of money this would actually spell their doom eventually, but they can make loads of money by releasing setting books. So things like Dark Sun, Planescape, Spelljammer, officials for Greyhawk and for the Forgotten Realms, Kara-Tur, all of these different settings. Like I said, eventually this would spell their doom in the late 1990s when everything is kind of like compartmentalized off into different lines. But at this point in time, it works. And what happens in 1990 is Ravenloft sees a major expansion. Ravenloft Realm of Terror, this book that I've got here, this is a reprint from Drive-Thru. It was originally published as a box set, but Realm of Terror was a huge box set that turned the original content of I6 into a fully developed dark fantasy, gothic fantasy setting. And it's part of that trend in second edition, but it was hugely successful. What Realm of Terror actually did was it suggested that the Valley of Barovia, where the village of Barovia and where Castle Ravenloft is, it's one of many kind of mist and shrouded domains on the domain of dread. And Mordantshire is another one, but there's like Sorain, there's all these different places on a kind of continent of doom, and they're all inaccessible from each other. And each of these realms, which kind of ended up being sort of expressive of different types of fantasy, not just gothic fantasy, or not just vampire fantasy, horror. Each of these realms are ruled over by a Dark Lord. So, like I said, Azalin the Lich Lord has a realm, Strahd has a realm, even Lord Soth from Dragonlance at one point ends up there, and he kind of rejects becoming a kind of Dark Lord and goes back to Kryn. There's lots of cool stuff going on. Now, it doesn't just do that, it also expands the rules. It adds rules such as rules for a terror and fear. This is, fear and dread, something that is very similar to Call of Cthulhu's sanity mechanic. If you are familiar with that game, it's kind of playing on that. This whole kind of setting would continue to be developed with adventures and further expansion booklets like Forbidden Law that I've got up here. Up until the end of TSR, basically, it would be really, really, really successful. Now, that's a rundown of I6 and its brilliance and the hugely popular setting that kind of sprang out of it. Next time, we'll look at Curse of Strahd, which is the adventure from 5e that really is a retelling of I6 with lots of expanded material. And we'll do a deep look at that. We'll talk about its writing quality. We'll talk about how it works and how it doesn't as a module, and how it is I think a really successful reimagining of that classic Ravenloft tale. Thanks for listening. Below you'll find links to all the stuff I've just talked about on Drive-Thru. You'll also find links to my own game, Journeyman Expert Master, and the free version of that game and a free adventure for that game. Like and subscribe. Thanks for taking the time to listen. I'm Gary, and I'll speak with you again soon.